Hey everybody, it's been a little while since my last video. Had a great but busy week this past week at the World Mission Seminar, so this one's getting a little late as well, but life's been kind of crazy, so hopefully you'll forgive me for the delay and the skipping videos, but I do want to continue what we talked about last time about relationships and specifically the marriage relationship. So we're going to jump back into that. And this time we're going to focus more on what the Bible says about wives and their relationships with their husbands. And this is kind of a touchy subject. A lot of people like to kind of steer away from it, don't necessarily like what the Bible says about it, or thinks that maybe it's a little archaic and not as culturally relevant. But it's in the Bible, so we have to pay attention to it. We got to give it our attention. And the Bible talks about wives being submissive to their husbands, and it says it both in Ephesians 5 and it says it again in Colossians. And Paul's the one that wrote those, and he talks about how the women are to be submissive to their husbands in a matter of respect. And I think that the word submission just gets a bad rap. It's treated um, as if you're being submissive, then you're being lesser, and that's just not the case. There's nothing that indicates that women are lesser or that wives are lesser, or that God thinks lesser of women or thinks that men are better. There's nothing to that regard at all. In fact, I would argue to say that being submissive, it maybe matters more, and it takes a very strong individual to be able to do that. Uh, Here's the difference, and I've had a friend that I've talked to recently about what it means when the Bible talks about women being submissive and husbands loving their wives, and what that means. Just the kind of relationship that we're supposed to have, and really, there's a big difference between submission and subordination. And I think that our culture, especially today, looks at submission as if it is subordination. So if you don't really know the difference, let me kind of define them as clearly and as simply as I can. Subordination is being put into a position. It's being placed under someone's authority, whereas submission is placing yourself under someone's authority or under someone's leadership. So if you didn't catch that difference, it's drastic. It's one thing to be placed under someone's leadership. That means that the choice, the decision, the uh, all of that, it's not in your hands. It's in someone else's hands. Um, you are put under someone else's authority or leadership. But submission is choosing yourself. Like, you have the choice to be under one's leadership, under one's authority, under one's direction. And that makes all the difference in the world, because that was Jesus. Jesus, as God, really, if we think about it, had a right to reject the plan that God had. Now, what would that look like? What would that mean about Jesus? I don't know. That's a lot of hypotheticals that I can't necessarily answer. But what I do know is what we are told in the scriptures, and what we do know about Jesus is that he did submit himself to the Father. But not only that, Jesus submitted himself to humanity. He submitted himself to the laws of physics, to the laws of the anatomy of the human body. He submitted himself so much so that he gave himself over to death. That is massive. So it's an opportunity to live out the gospel and to be an example of Christ when we choose to submit to one another. And husbands, there are times where we are able to submit to the advice of our wives. But ladies, the structure of marriage, the structure of the relationship is so that we can complement each other in our relationship, so that I can work out my strengths while my wife works within her strengths, and we are able to work side by side, and we are able to not just coexist, but we are to cooperate together within that realm and within those roles. There are times where Christine is much more apt to lead in a specific situation than I am, but she doesn't usurp me in order to lead. Now it's my responsibility as a husband to recognize those strengths and to bring her alongside me and say, "Hey, why don't you take this one?" Um, that's allowing her that opportunity. But when we give ourselves over to these things that the Bible indicates are part of the relationship structure, it allows our relationship to flow better. It allows our relationships to work the way they were intended. It's not so that I can rule over her. That's not the intent of these things. In fact, if that were the case, then the scriptures would have said, "Men, submit your wives or subordinate your wives to yourself." But that's not what it says. Paul speaks to the women and he says, "Submit yourselves to your husbands." You make the choice so that your relationship can work the way that God intends it to work. And it can work more smoothly, and you can work alongside each other. It becomes a cooperative thing, it becomes a complementary thing. And we get to complement each other within the relationship. That way, there's already order. And please don't look at it in a way where one's given more leeway or more authority or more power, I should say, than the other, but rather look at it in a way that we've already been given an order, we've already been given a structure within to work, which kind of takes the pressure off of us. But I want to wrap up with this because I don't want to take up too much more time. I want you to really hone in on what I said just a little bit ago, that Jesus himself was submissive to the Father. He is the prime example for men as those who are supposed to love. He's the prime example to us as a leader, but he's also the prime example to us when it comes to submission and to serving. We're all supposed to be serving one another. Husbands, we ought to be serving our wives that shows them and expresses love. And wives, you're supposed to be serving your husbands that shows that you're respectful of him and submissive to him. And when you submit yourself in that way, there's something supernatural. There's something godly about it. So don't run away from it, and please don't misunderstand. This isn't a matter of being ruled over. It's a matter of living within order, living within structure, and complementing your spouse. That's the beauty of submission. I want to say this about it too before I jump off here, but think about it this way. The word submission, just break it up. It's a compound word. Sub means under, to come underneath, and then mission is its own word. The mission, you and your husband ought to be headed in the same direction. You ought to have the same goals, the same purposes, the same aspirations. So you're coming alongside your husband. You're coming underneath the missions and the goals that are set in your life, and you're walking alongside him. In that way, it's something that's a beautiful picture, and I love it. Now, husbands, I'm going to come back at you like I did a couple of weeks ago and talk a little bit more in depth of what it means to really sacrificially love your wife, and that's not an opportunity to rule over, but rather it's a responsibility. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for listening, and I will see you guys